Here we are, folks, in peer review week. And you may recall last week I said peer review is the best, and it is! Peer review. All right, friends, colleagues. Keelan's popped our digital guide into the chat. And so I'm going to invite you over to that participant guide. We'll give friends a couple more minutes to get here. Keelan. Well, Zoom has aged us all. This has aged us all. But thank goodness there's filters. You put the filter on and then you just look just as young as you did before the pandemic. It's a fantastic, fantastic gift. As you all get into that gradebook and feedback peer review participant guide for today, I invite you to work on, as soon as I change this column, I did this last week too, forgot to change these colors. I invite you to work on the 3 columns toward the left, adding your name, the college or colleges that proudly get to call you their own, and then doing a little bit of reflection in order to set intentions for today. So thinking about those columns to the right, the first one, past your name, what do you know? Something you've learned from the sessions in general, right? Since this is our last session, it's a great invitation to just kind of take stock of what seems most useful, most applicable for you, something you've learned, or something you already know about peer review. And I invite you to think about the definition of peer review in those broadest terms possible, right? So this could be something you know about facilitating student-to-student feedback in your learning environments. It could also be calling from experiences you've had or participated in where your peer-to-peer feedback with another colleague, you're working together and creating or facilitating or receiving the benefits of working in that type of situation with a colleague. So what's something you've gotten from the session so far, or something that feels really solid and known to you about that topic of peer review? And once you feel good to go there, that last column in blue, setting some intentions, what do you still want to know? What resources do you wish you had at your fingertips? Speaking of resources, we had a request for a 2.0 on that amazing information that Keelan shared on Asao and Yue. And so that is going to be popped back in for us, thanks to Keelan. This looks like it might be our power group for today, our mighty partnership for today in peer review. So we'll take about, let's do about 1 more minute in that table. Don't worry about those white boxes yet. We're coming back to those. And you all know us so well, but we should introduce ourselves again, just for the record. I'm Nicole Bryant-Lesher, an English faculty here at College of the Redwoods. We do not have cactuses at College of the Redwoods, but we do rock our succulents up here. Succulents heart this weather very, very much. You just leave them alone and they do amazing. And then I am joined today by the amazing, multi-talented, are those daisies, Keelan? Daisy of a person, sunny daisy of a person. This is Keelan. Keelan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Keelan Koning. I'm here to, I guess, bring and also to support everybody in the chat. So please share any questions or thoughts that you have in the chat, and I will share those questions with Nicole, although today I think it's going to be more about you all.
It is. It is. Corrective lenses. Okay, so here we go. Again, please don't feel any pressure. This isn't a completion agenda. This table up here, we're going to come back to it. So I'm just going to invite us forward as a group onto page 5. Since this is our last session together, as much as I possibly can, I'm going to remind us of how the things that we've been doing can also be takeaways and applications that you utilize in your spaces with your students, with your colleagues. Learners are learners. And so oftentimes what we do works really well in whatever spaces we are guiding, teaching, or facilitating. And so this table up here that we've just spent some time on that invites us to say, you know, what do you already know? What do you want to learn? Great tool to invite learners, your colleagues, your students, to launch them and center them into where we're going to go, valuing the knowledge they already have. And then what we have here on page 5, coming back to our norms, our community values and practices, the moment where we build together to say, this is what I want our learning community to be. And these are the actions that are going to help us get there. And I find in particular, when I'm facilitating norms with groups that have less experience with this, which can be students, but frankly is often also our colleagues, is that it can be helpful, right, when you frame this, to invite folks to think about values and practices, right? Values are those statements of how we want to be that guide us and shape our orientation. And practices are the actions we need to take in order to realize those values. And so sometimes I find when facilitating norms with students that students are great at offering up really quickly those aspirations, what they want to see the community look like, but might need a little bit of coaching to say, okay, that's really valuable. Yes, we want to do that. How might we need, how do we need to be with each other in order to make that happen? And so as you're looking at our norms and values and practices today, my first question to you is, anything else we need to add for our own learning community? And then just inviting you to think for a moment, how might you take this practice that we've been doing over these 5 weeks and apply it into the learning spaces? Seeing some great stuff come up in the chat. Thinking about how to involve students at the beginning of the semester in those norms and establishing practices. It's a great time of the semester to get that started. Oh, I love the idea. Raylene shared the idea of having students establish norms for exams. That's a great way to create more of a community-based approach to problem solving around something students often have a lot of anxiety about. That's a brilliant, brilliant idea. So cool. Faculty inquiry groups, wonderful place for community building and norms. Love it. Yeah, it's a really cool idea on norm establishing for the activities. I wonder too, Raylene, not to put you on the spot, but just because this sounds like such a good idea, I'm wondering too, are you finding as you facilitate those discussions that it gives students a chance to surface either anxieties they might have or past experiences with this kind of learning activity that have been stressful? Are you finding that it's like adding double or triple benefits?
Well, what surprises me the most is that students are much stricter with themselves than I ever would be. In this all online environment, when I'm giving online exams, there's really no way that I can control what materials they have access to, including, messaging a friend and asking them to do the problem. I teach math. So what I really like is that when they establish these norms for themselves, I don't know, it seems like my sense is that they're more accountable because they're accountable to each other. I haven't really, I do a lot in my math classes with like math anxiety and stress reduction. I tend to teach classes where people absolutely hate math. You know, that's kind of my thing. Is I think there's a lot of that comes before we do this with the exams. So I'd say not specifically, but I do it in other places. I do that part of it in other places.
It's so cool. It's so cool. I wish back in my math class taking days, I wish there would have been norming so I could say going to the board and competing against other people to get a problem done first can we do it another way? Like it's making my brain stop working. Can we do it?
Yeah, I mean, I still do that. I use online whiteboards, and I did it today. You know, they Zoom into breakout rooms, and then I give them 3 problems to do, and then I randomly select, each group puts one of the 3 problems on the board. But, you know, it's like, I like, you know, and I say this out loud, I like wrong answers better than I like correct answers because it gives me something to do, right? And so, you know, so I think it just depends how you treat it. And it's never a competition ever, you know, ever. I hope. So, yeah.
And you're building that community with your students in so many ways, right? When they're talking about their anxieties, when you're creating those opportunities to norm, as you said, it's all those chances for students to create relationships with each other. And that's the glue, right? That's the glue that keeps them coming. It's the glue that makes productive struggle less intimidating. There's just so many benefits from creating structures in a class that move laterally and shift some of that way in which learning happens laterally. Rather than up and down. It's just tremendous. And so I really appreciate you pointing that out because it goes beautifully with where we're going today. Thinking about all those ways that we can step out of that up and down role with students, step sideways and let students support one another and be amazed at all the incredible benefits that has for them and also for us. So yeah, all right, let's get to it, shall we? Let's talk a little bit about peer review. First, just to say, if today, when you saw my email that said it's peer review, you thought you might have a cough or a cold coming on, and you thought that, you know, you wouldn't want your Zoom face to not be looking your best, and you thought maybe about not coming. Yes, this is what our students often feel when they know that peer review is coming. And so I so appreciate you coming in spite of, you know, feeling slightly under the weather with the idea that peer review might be happening, and, you know, moving through that place of anxiety. And just a moment to say and recognize that feeling that's really powerful because it invites us to feel what our students often feel. And if they're feeling that when you say peer review and you've done nothing peer review related in your class before, that's just an indication of what they carry forward. And that's often because peer review, however well designed in the moment, often doesn't have the pieces put in place prior to create the kind of trust building that's going to give us a beautiful foundation to work from. And so as we think about peer review together today, I would invite you to think about peer review as not a thing that happens on a single day, but as something that happens and you want to consider laying the foundation or the scaffolding for peer review prior to when it happens, and then helping students to bridge from when it happens to what they do next. Okay. So instead of thinking about it as a one-day event or a single assignment, you're thinking as a designer about what are the components that need to be in place, that students need to be familiar with or have ready prior to when I ask them to serve as feedback givers to one another. And these are things that, Raylene modeled talking about this really well with thinking about, okay, how am I creating reductions in anxiety in my class? How am I building trust building between students? How are we creating an environment where imperfection is valued as a necessary ingredient for learning? So all of those things that are that create a good foundation for peer-to-peer support, but are not about the thing itself, right? They're not about the content that's being discussed in peer review. And then thinking about after peer review, where do we go? How do we help students to be able to process when they receive feedback from their class colleagues, and then apply what they're hearing in a way that makes them, again, willing to do it again or value that activity. So just gonna hold that in your mind as we talk about peer review. This next page of this Google document, I literally use this exact page with my students when I talk about peer review, and we talk about peer review weeks before we start doing it in my classes, just in little bite-sized pieces to start laying the foundation for where we're going. So feel free to take it and repurpose it however it's useful for you, right? As everything else is that we share in our time together. So just some persuasive plugs for why peer review is so useful as one of the ways in which student learning happens in a class. Sharing ideas creates opportunities to think aloud with a partner. Often the act of explaining your plans to another person helps you hear them in a new way. It helps you identify elements of your plan that are working well and places to dedicate time and attention for further development. And again, if you've already spent some time in your class building students' capacity to understand that learning requires imperfection, right? That prototyping is part of how we learn, then this idea is going to nest so well with that, right? We start shifting to valuing looking at things in process rather than trying to make it perfect by ourselves before anyone else gets to see it. Actively listening to a partner's idea or plan offers the listener an opportunity to gain new perspectives and approaches. I have shifted my own classes to really honor this statement much more by changing how credit goes in my classes in activities where peer review happens. The ability to bring in a thing to be peer reviewed is no longer connected to earning credit, but giving feedback to somebody else is. And of course, the fear is then no one will bring anything. And I have yet to experience that. Instead, more people come and the feedback is better because they're really focused on giving that feedback. And then they end up coming away from it, folks who didn't bring a thing, end up coming away from it saying, I better understand how to do this thing now because I had the opportunity to give feedback on others. And so far, it's working pretty good in my classes to just kind of shift. Is it the product that I want to give the credit for? Or is it the action of giving feedback I want to give the credit for? And there's probably other ways, right? You can do a both and, but I do find that me placing the emphasis on the feedback and reducing the gauntlet of having to have the thing ready to go is making peer review work more for the goal of having good peer review. Offering feedback and support helps share the load of designing and often clarifies concepts or approaches for the listener as well as the speaker. So again, just all the benefits of doing peer review, even if you don't have a thing to get feedback on. And if you do have a thing to get feedback on, it's so nice to be able to see that from other perspectives. Probably most powerful about peer review is that it's less constrained by power dynamics. There's no assumed or stated expert and novice. And that can mean that there's not a need to perform a level of proficiency or hide messy work in progress. And so at its best, peer review invites us to truly be supporters of one another rather than judges of one another. And that's such a refreshing moment that can change what school feels like for students It can absolutely change what it feels like to bounce ideas around with colleagues in a department meeting. Can you imagine if there was an assignment or grading structure peer review outside of evaluation processes where we're just working with our colleagues, maybe cross-discipline, to talk about active learning or innovative grading practices, and we had a peer review structure that insisted that we work with one another as colleagues, as laterals, as equals, and that we step outside of those power dynamics that are baked in at so many levels in higher education. However, just making a peer review activity, creating it, putting it on your schedule, does not mean that those power dynamics will disappear, right? The miracle does not occur because you scheduled the event. The miracle occurs because of how you build the environment for that event to happen, which again is laying some groundwork first, being really specific in how you design, and then thinking about how you want students to process, learners to process as they go forward next. So some really easy ways to make the day of peer review more effective for students is to establish protocols for how that's going to go. In my classes, that typically means we have a few learning sessions prior to peer review so that we get really good with talking about what we mean when we say we're going to give feedback to each other. Our colleagues in the arts are fantastic resources to talk to about this, right? So if you have a colleague that you know who works in the visual arts or the performing arts, knock on their door, ask to have a virtual or masked cup of coffee. I don't know how one has a cup of coffee and remains masked. So let's go with our virtual coffee and say, hey, when you facilitate critique in your classes, how do you do that? How do you get students to give each other feedback on their product and their creative process in a way that makes everybody willing to do that and works well? Okay. They might be such a great partner for your thinking in this. But let's establish some protocols, help our students to have some protocols that shape the moves they're supposed to make when they go into peer review. And then let's go one step further and let's give them some language prompts so that when they're in peer review, 100% of their thinking can be about giving feedback on ideas, and they don't have to stress about, do I have the words to say that well? Because we're going to help them out with that, right? Knowing how to say something is its own learning concept. And so the more we can help with that, the more they can focus on practicing giving feedback, not worrying about how to say it. They care so much that they don't ruin somebody's day with the feedback they give. But we don't just want them to give smiley faces because that's not useful feedback, right? Useful feedback is going to support those ideas to grow. A thumbs up, not useful feedback. A smiley face, not useful feedback. Something more rich. This is what I notice and this is why it's working well. That's great feedback. So let's help them do that. In order to practice this, colleagues, you all are going to be doing some peer review. So let me walk you through the protocol that you're going to use so that you can see it, reminding you that anything that's useful to you here, you can take it, just take it, okay? So we're going to be moving you into groups. We'll whisk you lovingly into groups fairly soon. Keelan, in an ideal world, groups would have 3 people. Is that mathematically possible for us today? So ideally, we're going to get you into groups of 3. We'll see if we can make that happen. If not, we'll adjust. But while you're in a group of 3 and you're peer reviewing, you have 2 important jobs to do. One is the job of sharing. One is the job of feedbacking. And both of those are equally important. So let's walk through how you would do those. When you go to peer review, you are just sharing a thing that you're working on wherever you are in that process, wherever you are, right? It is just as valuable for a designer, an idea maker, to get feedback early in their process, right? I'm thinking about this. I'm not sure this is the direction I want to go, but it's just as valuable to get feedback at that stage as it is to get feedback on, here's my activity that I've built. I think I have it where I want it, but I'd love to have an extra set of eyes, or anywhere in between. Okay. You'll have the ability to share screen in your breakout rooms, if that will feel good for you, but don't put any pressure on yourself, right? You are an amazing describer just with your voice. But if you've got something you want to share, you can do that. Keelan, I want to make sure that that there isn't a button I need to push to make sure that folks can share in their breakout rooms. I think they can.
Oh, I can do it actually.
Thanks. Because I shouldn't say you can share your screen and then be like, actually, you
But it is
can't.
set- Yes, but it's set for you to be able to share. So please call for help if you need it.
Okay. We're not whisking you just yet. Now we're going to invite you to say, okay, that thing that you just said, it might be useful to have some feedback on this from some colleagues. I think I like these people. I've been hanging out with them for a couple weeks. Let me see what they think, right? So again, you're going to have 3 minutes to share on that. Okay. And while you are sharing, the 1 to 2 people in your group, they are listeners and they have jobs. Listeners, when the sharer is sharing, please take some good notes in the following way. Take some notes on good ideas you want to borrow. It's not called stealing when we're brainstorming together, right? But some good ideas you want to borrow that you're hearing from that sharer. And think about some questions or nudges, if you will, wonderings that you could share with the sharer that will help extend their thinking about the plan or idea. So your role is not to be an evaluator or to, vote the idea on or off of the island. Instead, your role is to just be a boost, right? You're just boosting, helping that next step along. And to help you with that, right? So for 3 minutes, you're listening, good ideas to borrow, questions or suggestions that will help extend the thinking of that sharer, right? And then it's your turn. And so each listener, after the sharer has shared for 3 minutes, each listener will have about 1.5 minutes. Okay. Give or take a little bit, but 1.5 minutes or so to give comments in response. And so let's say it's a group of 3, and let's say that it's Raylene and Alan and Sherry. And let's say that Sherry shares first. When Sherry's done with 3 minutes, Alan's going to take 1.5 minutes, and Alan's going to offer 1 to 2 affirmations or good ideas to borrow, right? If it made it onto Alan's list of a good idea, Alan should let Sherry know, right? And there's some verbal prompts over here to help, right? Think about these as like sentence launchers, great ways to end up with a good piece of feedback. So phrases like, I appreciate, or I like that, or your approach to creates the starter for a sentence that's going to help share feedback that says, this seems like a good approach, or this seems like a neat way to do this, right? I notice, I appreciate. And then after Alan gives 1 to 2 of those within Alan's 1.5 minutes, Alan's going to offer 1 to 2 questions or comments to help extend Sherry's thinking on that idea that Sherry's growing, right? And so some language prompts to help with this. The fantastic prompt, I wonder, right? I wonder what might happen if, or I wonder if you did this, right? Or as a listener, I need some clarity on, right? Helping that designer to notice a place where something doesn't quite line up or you're not quite following. Okay. How might, one of my favorite phrases in the whole world, how might you X or Y, right? Or I want to know more about, right? Helping that sharer to know a place to go deeper, add more explanation, add more depth. So each listener, whether it's one or two, will have 1.5 minutes to offer some affirmations, some questions or comments. And so Sherry, we're going with that example of you. Imagine that Alan's giving you feedback. When Alan's giving you feedback, you are the listener and you're just listening. You're just taking notes. It's going to be really tempting for those sharers who are getting feedback to start dialoguing right away, right? To turn that feedback into a conversation. But I'm going to invite you to wait on that and just let all that good feedback come on in. Take notes on what you hear, knowing you'll have an opportunity to dialogue with each other a little bit afterwards. Right? So resist that temptation to turn your opportunity for feedback into a dialogue session. Just soak it all in. Keep in mind too, if this is the first time that you've done peer review like this, there's a chance that it's new for your colleagues too. And some of the feedback that comes to you might not be a perfect fit with your idea. And that's okay because your idea is always and always remains your idea. So noting that feedback down as you hear it does not commit you to implementing it. It does not require you to take that feedback and make it actionable. It's an opportunity, not a requirement. So if somebody suggests something and you're like, I did that 5 years ago and that totally, nope, that's not going to work for me. Or there's something about my discipline that makes that completely untenable. That no, you can always note it next to those notes later. We're just thinking of possibilities at this point. They're just there to give some possibilities. So then the whole system rotates. Sherry was the first sharer. Alan and Raylene gave Sherry feedback. Roles switch. Alan's turn to share, 3 minutes. Sherry and Raylene each get 1.5 minutes to give affirmations and questions back. Rotate one more time. Sharing. Raylene gets to share. Alan and Sherry give feedback. Everybody's taking notes when it's their turn to be listeners. And then there's time for open dialogue at the end. With that, go do the fun stuff. You've had all the instructions. Go have fun. Share ideas with each other. We'll see you in a little bit over 20 minutes. Enjoy your time. Some great thoughts coming in the chat. I'm just going to open up the floor. So if you feel moved to do so, you're welcome to unmute yourself and share some of your noticings, and absolutely feel.
There were a couple of times while I was providing feedback that I wanted to apologize for my comments. And I started thinking about how I sometimes hear my students do that too, where they apologize for the comment they're going to make or for not maybe understanding it or something like that. And I wonder how to resist that temptation so that when you express feedback, you are doing it confidently and kind of without undercutting your own comments by apologizing for them.
That's a really, really powerful wondering. Colleagues, any
I wanted to comment about that. I think like with everything, when you start off with norms, you talk about stuff to expect. I think that goes back to when you start the peer review and setting expectations is sometimes, this is with good intentions, and sometimes we're not going to have the time to filter so much in our head, and maybe start off with that so that it gives people grace to say stuff or to maybe think about what was said in a different light. But by the way, Alan, I really appreciate, Alan was part of my group and I really appreciate your feedback. And I just think that it's great that you're reflecting on what you say. Sometimes some of us don't do that and that gets us in trouble, but maybe that's a way to share grace with ourselves and others in our group.
So powerful. So powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Any more gumdrops of awesome for Alan to think about with this? How do we help our students? How do we help ourselves to norm and feel supported in offering critique, well-meaning critique, but critique nonetheless? It's a super tricky piece to get comfortable with as feedback givers. One way we do this in my classes is that we practice with giving feedback on sample assignments that don't belong to anybody before we practice with each other, so that we're separating learning how to give feedback in general with learning how to give feedback to another human. And so, you know, it's always an enjoyable moment in class because when folks know it's a sample student, they're super rough on that sample student, right? They're like, oh my gosh, this thesis, you can't even make an argument about this, right? And so we talk about, you know, how do we move from what we think we notice to what would be supportive for that person to continue their work forward. And so that, you know, and then we start imagining different audiences, right? So like if this was your class colleague, how would you give feedback? You know, if this was your work colleague and this was something for work, how would you give feedback, so that we can start to imagine audiences? And so that practice, just the practice in general, but also practicing with helping them to imagine how they might do that, reduces the pressure the first time they have to do it. And I will often put folks in teams to do those samples, right? So instead of like everybody's going to just write privately feedback to a sample student to practice, they'll be in teams. Like, what did you see? What did you see? Let's talk about it now. Let's build a feedback letter to the sample student together, so they have someone to bounce ideas off of and dialogue with. Raylene had a great notice that was in the chat about giving feedback on a different discipline. Raylene, did you want to expand on that at all? You don't have to, but if you want to.
Well, I mean, and Kaylin responded with, yeah, that's the way we do it in reading apprenticeship. And yeah, I know. I mean, I've done reading apprenticeship courses and I do that. But so I'm just stating it's still kind of an uncomfortable situation.
Totally.
Because first of all, I don't want to appear stupid, you know, and I mean, even now it's like, yeah, okay. So of course I know nothing about teaching English, but you know, but you don't want to say that, right? Like, so I approached it from a different perspective, like pretending that I was a student reading through this assignment and what would maybe strike me as a student. And yeah, that was it. So
absolutely. It's really powerful to share and norm that vulnerability of what it feels like to give feedback, especially when it isn't our discipline, and invites us to imagine how some of our students who may be less strong in a skill that's going to be peer reviewed, and or imagine themselves to be less strong in a skill that's going to be peer reviewed. Let's say they read, they read somebody else's assignment and they're like, this is amazing. And I don't think my stuff's very amazing, or I don't think I understand the assignment as well as this person I'm giving feedback to. How could I possibly have anything valuable to give them? And I think that your sharing out actually identified a couple great life preservers we can throw to those students in those moments of peer feedback, right? So inviting them to think about what role are you occupying as the feedback giver, right? Or as the observer. you are their colleague, but yeah, it's super valuable if a student's like, oh, I don't think I'm as good of a writer, but you are the reader of that paper, or you are the thinker througher of that assignment. And so you're a great person to give feedback on clarity. You know, how clear are the ideas? If you were an outsider from the discipline, would this make sense? And that's super valuable for students to see, because sometimes those of us who are really strong in something make giant leaps when we write about it or when we work through it. And those assumptions and those leaps are not clear to others. And so even our less strong students, there's ways that they can give feedback. They just might have to imagine themselves in a different role or serving a different purpose than an expert who's critiquing, right? We got time for maybe one more before we do a couple other things. Any other noticings, takeaways you want, things that are bubbling now for you where you're like, oh, I might, perhaps I would, or this has me thinking about. So let's talk a little bit about how to, we talked a little about how to on-ramp into peer review, right? Activities that are going to help create a sense of comfort and trust for a group of humans who are going to give feedback to each other, whether that includes things like norming activities, where we either are explicitly talking about how we're going to work with each other in peer review, and or just how we want to be with each other in general as learners in a space. Opportunities to practice giving feedback, but not on one another, right? Just practicing the act of giving feedback through sample papers, sample activities where we have a chance to talk to another colleague, class colleague, to practice that before we have to do it for reals. The more you can do peer feedback as low stakes, right? So if the first time students do peer feedback in your class is for a 300-point assignment, no wonder they're nervous, right? If there's ways to integrate peer review for a 5-point assignment, so that the practice of giving feedback becomes some of the air that we breathe in our class on a regular basis, a way in which we learn in a regular basis. Doesn't have to take up a whole class period. 15 minutes, quick feedback to another person, so that we develop a rhythm for that. All those things can help on-ramp our students. Okay. Discussion protocols, really specific ways in which folks take roles in peer feedback, when peer feedback is happening, helps our students to have the tools they need in the moment. They've built the capacity in advance. Now they have the tools they need in the moment. And they know that they're learning, right? Constantly, I say to my students when we're doing peer review, this is its own learning concept. How to give feedback to others, how to receive feedback is its own learning concept, which means we're not going to be perfect on it the first time we try. There's no goal of perfection. And that we're going to feel some ambiguity and discomfort as we practice, just like as we learn anything else that's challenging, right? So we're norming that the process is the learning, and it just has amazing results that it gives. So then as we come off the thing itself, we need to help our students off ramp, right? If we do peer review and everybody has feedback and we go, great, can't wait till your projects come in, have a nice day, right? There's a chance that our students aren't going to be able to utilize that feedback well, whether they got really good suggestions from a peer reviewer or not. So just like everything else we do with feedback, right? When we are giving feedback to students, we may have a number of things we hope that feedback does, but I am hoping that I can convince you that the most important thing your feedback ever does, ever, is motivate your students to keep trying. That any other feedback you give is secondary to the primary goal, that that feedback boosts them, bridges them, rather than makes them think, I'm out, can't do it, wasn't successful. right? And some of our students are more vulnerable to critique of any kind, making them step out, right? Some of our students are more ready to see feedback as useful. And we can play a big role in how they frame feedback in their learning. So just like in every other feedback situation, when we do peer feedback, we want to have that off-ramp built so that students say, that was really valuable. And it can be that it was really valuable because they got good feedback, but it could also be really valuable because it invited them to review somebody else's paper, and that gave them good ideas, right? So just inviting them to think about, what can you take away from this? And there's a number of formal or less formal ways you can do that. Okay. So some places to help you think about this are here in resources for you that are on page 9. So just like every week in our participant guides, weeks of additional readings that you could do to help you. The left-hand side is theory, right? And I find that these are particularly useful guides this week. All things thinking about teaching innovation and peer review. And the right-hand side has a number of how-to guides for peer review. Some of these are literally like how to build the on-ramp, how to do what you do in the day, how to build the off-ramp. And a couple of these are connected to Canvas and how to use peer review in Canvas. Full disclosure, I do not use the Canvas peer review process. Some do, and they say it works wonderfully. I've not had success with it personally, and I think it's just that it's not the best fit for me and how I approach peer review as a teacher. And that's not a slam on it. I don't know, it feels itchy every time I do it. So instead of that, I use discussion forums in my online classes, and students attach their assignments and they partner up and they give feedback to each other rather than using the peer review. And it is harder. I have to do a lot of watching, making sure that folks, that everybody gets partnered up. But it is what it is. It works okay. It is way easier to do peer feedback in a face-to-face class than the online classes. There is software out there. You can always check with your Canvas coordinator or your distance ed coordinator to see if your campus subscribes to specifically peer review student-to-student feedback software. That's a plugin for Canvas. There are some out there. You got to pay for them, so they're not built into Canvas on their own, but your campus might have them. And so that's just a note to say you might want to check and see what's out there, because there is some really great software that is much more, it's super clear for students. Like they submit their stuff, they get partnered up with somebody else online in their class who's also submitted their stuff. The interfaces are really clear. It's all the things Canvas might be with its peer review in a few years, but isn't yet. And so your campus might have those things. Just a note to think about, check in. The other thing I would say about off-ramping, just think about an activity that students can do so that they're taking what they've learned from that peer review experience and they're surfacing it for themselves and they're making some next steps. Just like you all are going to do right up here in this table. Would you please take 3 minutes, find yourself in the table and add to the columns in white. What's something you learned today, a takeaway, something you want to take with you, and specifically what's next for you, right? So surfacing what it is that you got and then moving towards application. What's next? What are you going to do with that? What do you want to do with that? Setting some intentions for what comes next. So please take a couple moments with that. Last box on the right, do we have permission to share your amazing ideas? And we say permission to share. What we mean is, can we quote you when we share out to our 3CSN community? Our amazing communications coordinator, Keelan, just completed making the incredible mosaic that is our newsletter for the year. You probably received that in your mailbox. And what makes that newsletter powerful is all of those places where you speak to each other through sharing your words, your ideas, your thoughts, your plans. So if you're happy to share those things, you're like, yeah, put me in next year's newsletter, bring it. A why. If you're like, I appreciate you, Nicole, but not so much, you can just put an N so we know we won't take your stuff without your permission. When we're doing low stakes peer review stuff in my classes, my questions to off-ramp students are always about their process. What about this peer review activity today helped you with your thinking? What felt challenging? What felt great? And then questions of, what would you like to do as a peer reviewer next time? What's something you did today that worked really well when you gave feedback to somebody else? What's something you want to try next time? When it's a more high stakes activity, right, a bigger project, our peer review off-ramping has more to do with the thing itself, right? So like, what are 2 or 3 things that are on the top of your list to revise based on your peer review experience today? Right? Leaving enough room that it could be something they discovered on their own through reading somebody else's assignment or something they got feedback on.
I just put in the chat for everybody that we are starting the Gradebook and feedback series, which is not a hybrid, as I just tried to make it into, starting next week, and it will be on a new day, so it'll be Wednesdays at 10. So if you would like to join us, or if you know people who would benefit from this or would like to come, please share that link with them.
Think about the people that you love in your collegial life that are going to start to go into the pit of grading in the next 5 weeks. It's probably also you, but think about people you know who are going to look more and more tired in the weeks coming up, where the grading starts to turn into a mountain, and you love those people and you don't want to see them face plant. Invite them to come on Wednesdays. Say, hey, I know you could just be grading for this hour and a half, but maybe there'll be something here that makes the grading feel more doable. And nothing gives us the best nudge towards trying something out like extreme desperation when the workload gets high. So maybe think about your people that, you know, the adrenaline has to be at a certain level for them to try something new. We've arrived. We have the perfect situation for them. Bring them in. On our last page, page 10, my email, resources for you through 3CSN, and also all 4 previous participant guides from our series, and then all 4 previous recordings, but I think these recordings are from April, but I know they're all there. So you can also view my previous haircut and let me know, should I go back to that haircut? Should I stick with this one? And you have your participant guides, but that way you have access to everything we've been doing. I'll send you an email next week with a super guide in it too, of all the stuff in one spot. You could always use that super guide as the carrot to bring in those colleagues you're worried about. Be like, see, you get your own swag bag. Just come. It is always the most tremendous pleasure to get to spend time with you, to talk grading with you, to think about grading practices, all in the service of supporting our students and helping them to feel capable and brave and empowered to keep their learning going. So thank you for spending these 5 weeks with me and for being here for each other. It's really special. It means a lot.